So every time I look into nuclear power, which is usually in response to some I shouldn't say crazy, legitimate controversy like Fukushima or whatever, I actually went out and visited Yucca Mountain back when it was still possible. But everyone always says the next generation of nuclear reactors is going to be so much better, so much safer, pebble bed, all that kind of stuff. Is it like, you know, for 50 years people have been talking about Brazil as the country of the future, and it just we never quite get there. Are these new what are the new reactors like? If we could build them, what makes them different? What makes them safer? All that kind of
Yeah.
stuff.
Well, first of all, the ones we have are perfectly safe, but
Right.
but it's like a 747. It's a really great practical workhorse of a design, but it's an old design and we can do better with newer technology and new designs. The key to most of the next generation reactors is that the reactors are a lot smaller. Instead of building a giant reactor that's going to put out 1,000 or 1,300 megawatts, building it on location, which is a very technically difficult operation. You build a much smaller one in a factory. You turn them out much more quickly because you're working in a factory and you're making many of them instead of taking years to build one. You can iterate a lot more quickly. You can improve the designs. You can improve the tolerances. Then you deliver these reactors by barge or rail to the site where they're going to be used, and you kind of bolt them together. They might come in a few pieces. And then at a plant, instead of having one or two big reactors, you might install a half dozen much smaller ones. And what makes these reactors safer, and again, the ones we have are perfectly safe, but what makes these easier to run and maybe less worrisome is that unlike Fukushima or unlike 3 Mile Island, they don't require electricity to pump cold water into the core if something goes wrong. That's always your fear with a reactor, is if it loses coolant and that nuclear fuel gets too hot, then everything starts to melt and you have a big mess. It's not the China syndrome of the old movie, but it's a big problem. So these reactors are designed so that if anything goes wrong with the system, the reactor just turns itself off. The operator could literally walk away and the reactor just turns itself off. And because they're not that big, they don't have that much heat inside of them, and they just cool off on their own. They don't. They can use convection, gravity to keep water flowing if they do require water to cool them, and then they can just sit there. And so that's a nice advantage. It's both simpler to operate and safer if something goes wrong. What I'm describing right now is the type that's usually called a small modular reactor, and these are essentially scaled down versions of the nuclear reactors that we use today, that use water to move heat out of the reactor and then use that water to make steam, drive turbines, and make your electric power. There's another type that is coming down the path that some people call advanced reactors. The terminology is a little squishy, but the advanced reactors are include things like the pebble bed reactor that you mentioned. These are based on research that the U.S. Department of Energy or its predecessors have done going back really almost to the 1950s in new types of fuel, new types of cooling systems. Some of them would use molten sodium salt to to carry the heat out of the reactor. Others use high temperature gas like helium. So these sound really cutting edge, but in fact, the US government built reactors that work this way back in the 1960s. They tested them really thoroughly. We know a lot about these systems. Now, finally, we're at a place where a whole host of really interesting startup companies are designing these reactors, and they're actually moving toward implementation. So yes, to answer your question, we are on the verge of building these reactors in a number of places around the country. And the Department of Energy has actually been very supportive of this. The Biden administration deserves some credit. They've been really quite supportive of nuclear power. So was the Trump administration. As I said, there's a real bipartisan support here. So we're nuclear fans are really optimistic that we're kind of on the threshold of a whole new wave of plants being built. But we're also nervous because we have the Nuclear Regulatory Commission that is, I don't think they would say they're standing in the way, but their processes for approvals are so complicated, so arduous, they take so long that I'm really quite concerned that by the time these reactors get built, so much time will have gone by that then their economics don't look as good as they would if we could just build them right away.
So, one technical question: you say that the China syndrome is no longer necessarily a threat, but what about the Pepsi syndrome?
The what?
I'm sorry, it's an old Saturday Night Live skit,
So,
where Jimmy Carter visits a nuclear power plant and spills Pepsi on the
oh,
control panel,
yes.
and then turns into a 50-foot tall Dan
Well,
Aykroyd playing
you know,
Jimmy
I
Carter.
mean, the funny thing about all high technology is when things go wrong, it often starts with something like that. You know, the
Right.
simplest little thing. One nuclear power plant had to be shut down one time when mice chewed through some wires. I mean, nothing went wrong; it was fine. But it just shows you that you have to be ready for a wide range of eventualities.
I have my own views because I did that stuff with Yucca Mountain, but like, what do you say to people about the problem of nuclear
Yes,
waste?
I recently visited what people would consider a nuclear waste facility. Uh, due to the wisdom and political conniving of our former governor, Andrew Cuomo, our big, beautiful Indian Point nuclear plant on the Hudson River, about 30 miles north of New York City, shut down in 2021. And of course, that meant that our consumption of natural gas and our carbon emissions shot up dramatically. This is part of a supposed green policy. But what's interesting there to me is all of the fuel that plant is used is stored on site in what are called dry casks. After the fuel comes out of a reactor, first it goes into a kind of a swimming pool for a few years. It loses a lot of its heat and radioactivity. And then you can take those rods out and store them in these big steel drums that are surrounded by reinforced concrete. It looks, if you can imagine, kind of a squat farm silo. That's what it looks like. So sat on the pad with all these dry casks and leaned up against them, and it's a it's about as safe a way of storing spent nuclear fuel as you can imagine. The Yucca Mountain you mentioned was the U.S. government passed a, a bill requiring the DOE to establish an underground or a safe storage facility, and they spent billions developing this facility, Yucca Mountain in Nevada, which I'm sure you've talked to your listeners about how it got shut down basically by Harry Reid and Obama's unwillingness to really fight to to make sure that the will of the people was followed and this national facility was set up. So now we just store the fuel, the spent fuel on the sites of nuclear plants around the country. I think there's about 70 facilities that have spent fuel on them, maybe a little bit less than that. It's not a great option, except the more you look at it, it's actually fine. These facilities are all guarded; they're safe. Nobody's going to drive up with a truck and steal one of these casks. They weigh way too much to cart away. You could shoot grenades at them, try to bomb them. There's just really not much of a risk with this. Is it a solution that'll work for thousands of years? No, but we're a smart civilization. We'll deal with it. The thing to remember is there's so little of this spent fuel. The Department of Energy always says if you took all the fuel rods from all the plants that have made electric power in this country through our history and stacked them on a football field, they would stack up about 30 feet deep. you know so it's not that much, uh and so yes, it needs to be managed. Would it be nice to have a national facility? Yeah, eventually, but the system we have right now is fine. And the really interesting thing is some of these next generation reactors are set up that they can actually use spent fuel. Most of the energy in that fuel is not fully extracted in a conventional nuclear power plant. So you could take those old fuel rods, reprocess them, and use that fuel again. So instead of looking at these as nuclear waste dumps, we should look at them as repositories of clean energy, we could stop mining uranium tomorrow, just use the energy that is embedded in those spent fuel rods at plants around the country, and we could power our country for something like 100 years.